Okay, I'd like to take a few minutes to talk about color bleed and how we can work with color bleed, eliminate color bleed if needed um, in our scene. So first, let me just clear the air and say that color bleed is a natural occurring phenomenon. So when you see a lot of color bleed in the scene, it's not necessarily something that Mental Ray is doing wrong. That's a natural occurring phenomenon. Now, I'm sure that a lot of you have seen these Cornell boxes. When I talk about color bleed, this is what I'm referring to, where you have, sort of a white neutral colored space, and then you get this pink tone off of this red wall, a blue tone off of the blue wall. That's the light coming in and picking up some of that color from that wall and then transferring it elsewhere into the room. So as I said, it happens. It's a natural occurring phenomenon. So a lot of times it's an unwanted effect, especially by designers that tell you, I want this wall to be a certain color, and there are factors like light color, color bleed that tint that color. So it's very difficult to provide an exact color source at times. So what I have here is just a basic scene, interior scene that's good for creating color bleed, because you trap a lot of photons, a lot of light source in here. A lot of light is bouncing around, so it transfers a lot of the color very well. So what we're going to do is, if I just render this out, what you have is just a neutral colored scene, and you've prepared this, let's say, for the designer to look at. The designer comes by and says, "Oh, it looks great. I love the white walls, but you know what? I like the floor to be blood red." And you, of course, say, "Well, how red do you want it?" And he wants it red enough for his retinas to bleed. So let's just go ahead and change this to, let's make it red. Something like so. Speaking of picking colors here, one thing that I'll never do is make something like 100% a pure color, just because you won't have that in the real world. So normally I'll tone things down to at least, I try not to go beyond 0.9 when I'm picking out colors. So if I give this a render now, what's going to happen is we're going to pick up this red. Is going to transfer through the room. So what I'll do is just take the original render and throw this into the RAM player and move it off to the side for now, and just give this a render. Okay, so as you can see, I don't think I really need to load this in the RAM player for a visual, but it's here. Why not? As you can see, we have just a little bit of a difference now. So the designer comes by and says, "Hey, the floor is spot on. That's what I wanted. But you need to put the white walls back." And there is where the problem lies. So how do you do that? Well, of course you could render it out in separate passes, something along those lines. But there are a couple of other solutions. Now, for indirect illumination in the scene, I'm using both Final Gather as well as Global Illumination. So we have really two things to deal with here. We have to deal with the photons picking up this color, and we also have to deal with Final Gather picking up the color. Back in the day, before some of the things that I'm going to talk about in a second come about, one of the things that we would do would modify this photon shader, and you can assign different photon shaders for how a material acts. We could, for example, put in a photon basic shader here on this A and D material for the floor. Now I can control the diffuse color, the specular color, and the amount of transparency. So I'll leave the transparency at black here, but let's set the diffuse color to, well, actually we want to cancel out. I'll just leave them where they are because we're trying to cancel out the red. So What this is going to do is modify how this particular material interacts with photons. So what we're telling it is that the diffuse photon color will be this color, the specular photons will be white. So if I just give this a render now, what's going to happen is those photons from the global illumination will now be white. And so I'll go ahead and cancel that render. You can see how it's not as red as it was a while ago in the original render. However, it still has a little bit of color bleed. And why is that? Well, we corrected this material, or adjusted, I won't say corrected because there's nothing wrong with it. We adjusted this material for global illumination, for the photons. So what's happening is we're still picking up some red from the final gather. So just dealing with the photons alone will not cure or reduce the color bleed. You still have to deal with it when you're using global illumination and final gather. You still have to deal with it with final gather as well. So what I'll do is just delete this photon shader because I want the A and D material to handle the photons for this material instead of me overriding it and possibly getting things wrong there, as you can easily do. As you can see, this is an overbright area, and that's just because I had remember that pure white color for the specular photon option there. So generally speaking, I would disadvise against using any of these like the photon shaders in here unless you're trying to do something specific. A better way of working with color bleed would be to use a ray type switcher. And what we can do with this is we'll come back up to our floor material here and come down in the shader selections here, and we're going to select this ray type switcher, mental ray type switcher. And now what that does is it handles all the different rays in the scene. As you can see, we have eye rays, which is what we actually see here, transparency rays, which if I had, let's say, a glass teapot here, right now it would render black because the transparency rays are black. If I set that to red, then it would pick up the red from the floor. So the reflected rays, the refracted rays, final gather rays, as well as the photon rays. So this is sort of like a one-stop shop for controlling all the rays in the scene. So what I want here is, as again, the designer wanted this red color here, so I'm going to put the red put this red into the eye ray slot. And then I want to set up, since I want this to reflect properly in the scene, I'm going to copy it down to the reflected rays. And also, in case I have any transparent objects, you want them to reflect the red as well. Refracted, same thing. Now we get to final gather rays. The final gather rays, I don't want this red anymore. So what I'm going to do is specify, let's say 0.8. So when final gather hits this object, it's going to return as if the material was white or off-white. I want the same thing to happen with the photon rays because, again, I'm working with global illumination as well as final gather. And global illumination shoots photons, whereas final gather doesn't. So that's why there's two separate switches here for it. So now, if I go in and I render this scene, okay. So now, as you can see, we've eliminated the color bleed from this floor. It's actually, well, I can't say we've eliminated it. We've made it bleed white now, if you will. It's still picking up color, but it's that neutral color instead of picking up the red and transferring it throughout the room. And you can also see, since we put in, since I defined red for the reflected rays, you can also see it's reflecting properly on the chair legs as well as in the light fixtures. So that's one way of controlling or eliminating color bleed. You can control it, of course, by modifying these colors. If for whatever crazy reason I could make this red floor bounce a green color. For final gather rays, I could have it bounce a different color for the photon rays. I'll just use green again. And if I give that render, what's going to happen is it's still going to produce the red floor here, but the walls and everything will look like it's a green floor. So, you know, I don't know if there's a use for something like that. I'm sure that somebody would use it for something creative, but that's one way of doing that. Let me just cancel that. So that's again the ray type switcher, and I believe that was part of the production shaders. So you should have that in 2008 and 2009. If you don't have it in 2000, which in 2008 you can go and unhide it. It may be a hidden shader, but it'll be in the production pack. Now another option that you have here, let me just remove this shader. Another option that you have here in 2009 is that if I was using strictly global final gather for the indirect illumination of this scene, I could go in and go to Object Properties, and under the Mental Ray tab here, there's a Final Gather Control section. Now, it's set up by default to return the object color, which is physically correct. I could have it return black, or I could have it pass through, become invisible to Final Gather. So if I set this to return black, and again, this is just Final Gather control. I'll turn on Global Illumination, show you what happens in a second. But if you're just using Final Gather, and I give this a render, as you can see, it returns a darker room, but that's because we set it to return black. It's not picking up the red from the color bleed from this floor. Let me just turn that back on, set it on the default setting so you can see the difference. Make a copy of this frame. So you can see here we're picking up the red color bleed on the walls, whereas we didn't here. So that's another option. If you're working with Final Gather only, of course that's going to return a black color, so that will hinder your lighting, your lighting calculation a bit. You can see how that was a lot darker in the room. So probably the better solution is to stick with the ray type switchers and control it that way. Just wanted to show the other method. Now there is yet another option for controlling this, and it may be the simplest option of all. Just depending on your scene. For this scene, it's a fairly simple process. One is just apply a neutral color material to the floor, have this save out to a calculation, and I'll just call this color bleed test, and generate this Final Gather map and save it using the neutral colored floor. Alright, and then once that's calculated, just go ahead and freeze that calculation and then apply the red floor again and give that a render. And there's the result you would get. Again, there's no color bleed because we calculated the Final Gather using a neutral material and then saved it and then let it render with the red material. So there was no indirect illumination calculation going on when it rendered this red floor. So that's another method that you could use. If I had to choose just one, I would just use the ray type switcher, because that's easy to control, easy to put down on just one material. If one material is creating problems and you're not affecting the lighting solution for your other materials. So again, you just assign that to, let's say, the color slot of this A and D material, and you can, go in and assign your bitmaps, regular textures, whatever, to this just as you would normally, except it's just going to go through this ray type switcher. So that's how you can work with color bleed. I know I went through that kind of quick, but a lot of information to cover here. So just remember, use the ray type switcher, or assign a different material to your floor, and then calculate the final gather, freeze it. That's two different methods that are widely used. So hope that information helps.